don't apologize for calendaring your time away from work as much as you do at work.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
This week on Power Supply, we speak with Deborah Wiggs, founder at V2V Management Solutions. Deb has been transforming medical care delivery since her career began. She's established rural health clinics, grown multi-specialty physician practices, and facilitated countless strategy sessions that have helped clients achieve a sustainable competitive advantage. Deb's great love is to pass this knowledge along via public speaking with humor, practical reality, and a commitment to provide resources that transform how care is delivered. As a past board chair of MGMA, she understands the complexity of the healthcare system and knows how to work in it without making it more complicated. Her strengths lie in strategic planning, governance, and leadership coaching. And I can tell you, we are very excited to kick off this episode of Power Supply with Deb talking about working from home. And when we talk about her public speaking and her sense of humor, Gary, I know you've known Deb for quite some time, but it's going to make today's episode so interesting and fun to listen to.
Yeah, absolutely, Justin. It's just a pleasure to have Deb on our podcast today. Deb has the capacity to really reach the true individual at home and really transition from where they were the normal 10 and 5 in a hospital setting. 10 feet, you see them. 5 feet, you welcome them. How you doing? She's been in that setting. She's been in those different executive levels, and now is really working to create an environment that is useful for the listening audience. It's just a pleasure to have Deb today to join us. I think with her wealth of knowledge, it's going to be a podcast to remember.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to just the strategies because so many of us have had to learn how to work at home. And all three of us have gone through that, Gary. You, me, and Hayes have all made that transition. And it's not always an easy one. So having Deb's insight can really put some practical strategies in place. So we'll be right back after a short break with Deborah Wiggs, founder at V2V Management Solutions.
From 17 Studios, you're listening to Power Supply.
Joining us now is Deborah Wiggs, founder at V2V Management Solutions. And we're going to be talking today about something that many people across the United States, not just those of you in supply chain, but many people have had to learn to adjust to in 2020, which is working from home. So, Deb, really excited to have you on this episode of Power Supply. And I think that this is a very timely and relevant conversation for the audience.
Thanks a lot, guys. It's really great to be here. When I was thinking about this conversation, I started thinking, and I tend to think in what I call the rule of threes. And what does it mean to be at home, and what do you need to be paying attention to? So I have three things we're going to talk about today, and it was frame your work, frame your space, and frame your attitude. And it made me realize I've got the framework for home. And so that was kind of my little happy moment because I like to put little fun things around thinking things through. But another rule of threes I'm going to give you all today that has really nothing to do with the topic, but is something I've learned through many, many years of both speaking and sitting here listening to other people speak, And that is the intention that I have for each person listening to this podcast at wherever point you are. And it's a challenge. And my challenge to you is, as you're listening to us talk today, I really want to encourage you to, first of all, look for an affirmation. Look for something that we're talking about that you can say to yourself, great, I've got this covered, and give yourself a pat on the back for it. You thought of this, you could have done the topic, you've got it nailed. The second thing, which is my biggest excitement for me, is the challenge of inspiration. Is there something I'm going to be talking about with you guys today and with Hayes and Gary that is an inspiration for you, something you hadn't thought about that just tweaks the way you're thinking? Hopefully at the end of this podcast, you'll be able to answer that question in the affirmative. And then the last one is the most challenging one for you, and that's a conviction. What is it that you hear today that you realize, I've got to go and do something about this? And my challenge is, when you hear that thing, first of all, you write it down. And then my second challenge is to put a time limit on when you're going to do it. It'll be some little thing that you need to change or fix about your workspace or how you think. And I'm going to just challenge you with that. And at the other piece of that challenge is that you tell someone that you're going to do it, because that's how we get stuff done. So with that, just kind of jumping into talking about working from home, what you need to know about me besides the bio that you heard is that I've been working from home in some capacity for probably about 20 years now. Now, not all the time, because my professional career as an interim executive has taken me to many different cities around the country and many different healthcare environments. However, it all starts with me working from what I fondly call home. Home for me is Bellingham, Washington. I'm sitting there right now looking out across Bellingham Bay, and it's a wonderful place to live, and I feel very blessed. But in my looking out from where I'm working right now, I recognize there's a lot of things I have done to create an environment that allows me to actually get the work that I've taken on done and being productive while doing it. So the three things we're going to talk about again today are, first of all, frame your work. The second is frame your space. And the third is frame your attitude.
Thanks, Deb. I appreciate that. And the rules of threes, what you're always talking about, I think is so advantageous for us. And diving into the different framework, building a thought process. I think you're really building that inspirational piece you're talking about and the conviction with the framework. So excited to see where you start this off. Is frame your work the first you're going to talk about as we move forward?
Right. Yes. So frame your work is where we're headed first. You need to have some sense of what it is that you're supposed to be doing. And I think that is something we don't always know or understand, especially when we're here kind of by ourselves. And what is it that I'm supposed to get done? And you may know it if some people are task-based. And I got to say, one of the things I was researching is the number of folks who are working from home now that are in management roles, where the boundaries of work are a little bit fuzzier than those who are task-based workers. And it's probably easier as a task-based worker because you typically run on a calendar schedule or a list of responsibilities that are cyclical, and that can give you more structure to your work. But it appears that from when I've done some research on the number of folks working from home, about 55 to 60% of the workforce is at home right now. And close to about 80% of that is folks who are in what are called management or computer-based positions, where all of your work exists kind of in a virtual space, even when you're managing people. And so how you think about your work and what your priorities are is something that you need to get clear, first of all, from your company or from your own management team or your boss, and making sure that your expectations are in alignment. I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges is, are we all on the same page about what the work is?
It's so interesting that you say that, Deb, because It's one of those things where management may not even be ready to answer that question, especially when they're thrust into the situation, which is what we've seen, over the last 12 months, or I should say 10 to 12 months.
Right.
And I remember I was a provider. So I was a nurse. I worked that 7 to 3 or 3 to 11 total shift work. You punch in, you punch out, and there's many office-based people that are used to that as well. And then I remember I took a job where I was supporting physicians' offices in the community. And so I all of a sudden had this work from home nursing job, and I really directed what my day-to-day activities were as well. So it was a very autonomous role. And as you talk about being task related, sometimes I was creating tasks that weren't necessary. And I also really lost a grip on my schedule. And I would have these experiences of guilt, like when I would stop working at home to have lunch and do things that I would normally do at work that all of a sudden didn't feel right. And I think that really speaks to the alignment that you're talking about.
Yeah, and we're going to get into some of that around the breaks and things when we talk about frame your attitude. But that whole thing of expectations. And one of my favorite word pairs is clarity and accountability. And so I challenge folks who are in management roles to be thoughtful about creating clarity for your team with the associated accountabilities. As someone who is at the desk waiting for the work or wondering what the work is to call the question. There's a lot of really great apps out there. Our company uses something called Monday.com, and this isn't a plug, it's just an example, okay, of a tool that creates an environment that helps everyone to get to clarity on what the tasks are and who they're assigned to and what the expectation of time frame or deliverable is. So it's really about getting honest about the fact that I frequently find myself having an expectation even of my team of what I call osmotic understanding. If I think it, therefore you shall know it. And that's a really big challenge when we're in this virtual environment where we're not seeing each other and reading each other's body language, or more importantly, hearing I used to call them cubicle conversations. I don't know that anybody works in cubicles that much anymore, and certainly not right now. Even though it wasn't your conversation, we would get a lot of input into our universe from the environment that we were in and the people around us. When I'm working in large hospital systems, just hallway conversations, and you catch snippets and it would inform you. We're kind of in a snippet desert right now, I guess, for want of a better way to say it, where we're not getting all of that feedback on a daily basis of having multiple people going all around us. We're in this kind of cocoon. And so we have to kind of, I guess, artificially push out for ourselves, because at the end of the day, we want to be productive. I know no one out there, or it is unusual for most folks to say, I don't want to do the work, especially if it's something in your profession you're excited about. You want to do it well, and you want to do it clearly, and you want to feel like satisfaction for what you're getting compensated for. And it's no fun to find out it wasn't the work.
Yeah, Deb, and I want to back up a little bit. You brought up a really good point. It's all diving into those expectations and meeting those expectations and working well from home, as we're talking about. But one of the things is like these tasks. We're sitting at home right now. We're trying to figure out what to do. Am I truly multitasking? And, will you comment on that a little bit? Because I know you have experience in that. Will you just kind of talk about that a little bit?
So if you're talking about, because I know Gary's heard me say this before, there is no such thing as multitasking. That is a mythology. There is such a thing as microtasking. And I actually am a pretty big fan of microtasking, which is my phrase for it is small steps frequently. And so it isn't unreasonable to break things down into small steps that you can then get to completion. So at the end of the day, multitasking means that you just have lots of things that you frankly get half cooked done. I think we have this perception of multitasking, and somewhat I think is from being in environments with one another where we hear lots of other things going on and we count that as multitasking. I don't buy that. At the end of the day, though, I think we need to not assume multitasking is not something we should be proud of. Microtasking all day long. And the more microtasks you get done, the further along you are in your work or what you're trying to accomplish.
I like the analogy, and I think it ties into where you're getting into is framing your space. How do you frame that space with moving forward, those little bits and pieces to move it forward? So I think you have some comments on what's the space look like from home? What does that look like to you?
Right. And what it is, Gary, is that you want to think about what your work is and then create in a space that allows you to get that done effectively. And it's kind of looking at it, first of all, workspace is not on your couch. It's not in your bed. Frankly, it probably shouldn't be your dining room, but I'm also being sensitive to the fact that all of us have different living environments of what we call home. And for a lot of folks, that includes other people, children, pets, all kinds of things. So it's important for you in understanding the context of the work that you do and all of those micro tasks and what is it you set yourself up for to be successful in your physical space. And for me, I have my desk. I have actually 2 homes, so I get a desk in both places. They're identical. I require 2 screens. I haven't really looked and researched into how much employers are supporting the technology and the equipment that you need. I think that varies from company to company, from everything I know. But in my environment, our company covers our expenses for screens and keyboards and all those kinds of things. So I think it is variable. And I don't know too many companies that don't do most of that. But at the end of the day, you have to think about it. I'm flipping back and forth between multiple screens because of the work that I do. If I didn't have both those screens, I would have some challenges ergonomically. And that's the other thing that I really want to challenge folks. If working from home for you is sitting on your couch with your laptop, I don't care what age you are, you're going to start to have physical issues with your body. With a healthcare background, I cannot encourage you all enough to put yourself in an ergonomically appropriate space. So it means sitting at a desk with a chair. Stand-up desk is great. Anything like that that affords you. The other thing you need to pay attention to is lighting. Do you have a good lighting? Because screens, or you need to think about, if you're using screens a lot, how the blue in screens affects you, and do you need to wear special glasses for that? I think that having, keyboards and mice, that they all need to be as ergonomically appropriate in your home workspace as they would have been in your office space at work. And hopefully employers value that, but take advantage of the resources out there to make it a effective workspace. It also helps then to define when you're at work. And I think that's another piece of it. I do know that one of my friends actually cleaned out a hall closet that was their linen closet and put a desk in there. And that's where she works now. She has a little curtain that goes across. For her, that works. For me personally, that would be too small of a space, but it really defined for her where she could work effectively. So I think you really need to be creative about that and maybe look at some spaces in your home that are formally labeled for something else and think about it differently. And the reason why I'm saying this is because working from home is not going to go away. I think that's one of the things that was really fascinating to me, you guys. 42% of the U.S. labor force right now is working from home full time. That's remarkable. And that number has been going up. Like I said, I've been working from home for 20 years. It's not like this is a new thing. Some of the other things that are interesting from a planning perspective for what you're doing are also things around technology. If you don't have a good connection to the internet, those are some things that you need to explore. It is a concern that there could be some challenges in disparate opportunities for people if they don't have good access to technology. I will tell you that I live in a condominium that has cable from the 70s. The good news is we're getting upgraded literally this week to all the fancy stuff that's out there. But at the end of the day, we've had to fight that. There's about 6 or 7 of us in our condominium unit who are all professionals who've all had to move to working from home. I used to be the only one. I never worried about bandwidth. Now there's 6 of us fighting for the same bandwidth because of the way we're set up. And one of them is international. And so, but he's changed his day around because he works international. He works way more at night than in the daytime. So I was thinking differently about our space than we normally do, or our schedule.
Deb, obviously we've got 42% of the people working from home now, a massive transition from where we have been before. Yep. And one thing that I have found out, and I'm curious to hear your perspective, is isolation. Even though people they're not in that hallway conversation, though water cooler. Do you have any strategies or things that you would suggest to people to feel included if you're a management?
So from my perspective, that leads us right into frame your attitude. And there's a couple of different things, because that is one of the things that came up in some of the statistics I was looking at. Loneliness is the biggest complaint about working from home. And the biggest challenge from working from home is communication. I believe that the first thing you need to do is, as you frame your attitude, is giving yourself permission to maybe work differently than you would in an 8 to 5 environment. You're not commuting anymore. You're not going out for lunch anymore. A little while ago, one of you guys talked about, feeling guilty about taking a break for lunch. Well, that's what calendars are for, from my perspective. And I mean, there's tons of great devices wearable devices that can remind you, is it time to stand up? Is it time to take a break? Don't apologize for calendaring your time away from work as much as you do at work. I know the other day I was talking actually with Gary about Microsoft Teams and the monitoring that's now going on. There's more and more ability to monitor what people are doing while they're at work. And I would suggest be your own best advocate around that. My calendar is my world, and I have no problem putting everything on it. But I don't want people to see it. I make it private, and it keeps me sort of honest about what I am and what I'm not doing. And I would encourage people, without apology, think differently. I make sure every day I'm outside walking. I make sure that, and I live in Washington State, which is like rain central, as you all know. That's what rain gear was made for. So we're outside. I make sure I get outside every day. In the midst of the pandemic, that affords me actually to see people without being at risk. And I make sure that also, and our company does a lot of obviously online calls. And we do them in different ways, but I think that's something else we have to make the effort. And my first response to folks when they're feeling isolated and lonely is, well, when did you call someone? When did you talk to someone on the phone? Talking to someone on the phone is different from texting and emailing. So you've really got to make sure that you tee yourself up for your own success. The flip side of that, or maybe the shadow side, is not getting sucked in, or what I call hoovered. And for those of you who aren't old enough, hoovered is a form of a vacuum cleaner. So I call it the Hoover maneuver, when you get sucked into a environment, or like in social media or something that's a distraction. So you need to be careful that both as you frame your work and your expectations and deadlines and your attitude, that you don't become distracted by things that aren't the work. So there's some accountability there. And that comes back to the management side of things and how you support your team. I think it's important to do silly little things like have meetings where you don't necessarily focus on the work, but you maybe just do have one of those brainstorming sessions. I know within my company, and folks have participated, I'll throw out a question to people and just expect people to talk about it, not necessarily about the work we do, but some aspect of the bigger picture, or some tool they've discovered, or some way they think about things differently. So from a framework perspective, that is the place where I go to for your attitude. The other thing I'm going to talk about very briefly, and this is somewhat my healthcare background, is it's real easy to become dependent on things that are unhealthy. And so I really challenge people, watch your alcohol consumption, watch medication use, watch the different kinds of things that can cause Hoover maneuvers, where you get sucked into them and you don't even realize it. That's a place where accountability, having someone else on your side, it may not be a coworker, but someone else can come alongside you. And frankly, I'm a virtual runner now, and I have several friends, and we do a lot of, I wouldn't call them necessarily competitions, but encouragements with one another. So we find ways to engage. And what that does is, at the end of the day, is it influences my attitude. So when you're framing your attitude is by finding ways to have fun.
It's kind of interesting because you talked about your schedule and calendaring, which was really such a key point. Don't be afraid to calendar in personal time, but you're tying that right into what you're saying now, which is establishing this level of balance between work and life, because all of a sudden, for many people, work has just bled all into their regular life. They don't have that clear separation. And so at the same time, we're also cooped up. There's an additional thing. It's not just a traditional transition to being more autonomous and working from home. There's also very limited opportunities to leave your home that is stacked on top of that. So it almost requires that extra sort of mindfulness or thoughtfulness about what can I do for me? Because there's a lot of things I used to do that I can't or don't do now because of the environment we're in. And so I like how you said that leads us to also be vulnerable to some other unhealthy behaviors too, because that might feel like the only thing that's left that you enjoy doing because you can't necessarily get out. I don't know. Maybe you want to add something to that.
Well, I do think that I worry about that for folks, frankly, is finding those behaviors that aren't healthy as an alternative. However, I can think of a pretty long list, and I mean, that's kind of a fun thing to do. And maybe you do it with your family, but sit down and make some lists. And lists are a wonderful tool for a sense of accomplishment. That's certainly for me. When I've been challenged in my own life for life circumstances or whatever, I have found that I create lists as ways of back to that microtasking and senses of accomplishment. And what are some goals I can put out there? Again, the rule of threes runs my life. I do things in groups of threes, in days that are multiples or hours or multiples of three. So when I'm up against something really difficult, I tend to break it down into to groups of, okay, in 3 days, I'm going to have this done. If it's a really big project, I give myself 3 months, and then there's backing into it from that, and any kind of multiple 3, 6, 9 that allows me to get some structure around something. And that doesn't hold me hostage. That's the other thing, I guess, is none of this should hold you hostage. All of this should be something that you kind of see as, I'll tell you what just popped in my head right now is Aladdin and the magic carpet that kind of glides us through something to a new place. And I think that's probably one of the more important things is to see ourselves as working forward. I do a lot of speaking on don't look back, you're not going that way. I think that's one of the more important things we have to see ourselves is we're not living in yesterday, we're getting ready for tomorrow. And so it is about how you frame your attitude and your thinking. I encourage folks to turn down the volume, quite frankly, on a lot of things which are going to sound like heresy, especially in a podcast, but things like social media, getting fixated on news and things like that don't change anything for you in this day. It isn't that you shouldn't be informed. It's just I'm saying, and this is, from being in the workforce for now, 50 years, I guess. I just realized that anyway, that there's just some things that are about making, and see your role as making a difference. And it may be in your family, it may be with your friends, but don't be the person waiting for someone else to do it. Be the person out there doing it so that someone else can be successful is a part of, I think, of what we need to do is that we frame our perspective on things.
Well, that's the attitude of a leader.
Yep.
Novel idea.
Right? I mean, yeah, that's the attitude of a leader. And, I've heard that loud and clear throughout this interview, Deb, is just the leadership qualities. I love the way you summarized it at the end. Don't wait for somebody else to lead, become a leader and lead this for yourself and for the people that you care about in your life, whether that's your coworkers or your family, but you don't have to have a title to be a leader. We can all lead in our own ways.
And I mean, that's some basic stuff from kind of 101 is we always are leading at least one person, and that's ourselves. That's one of the things I just really challenge people. I don't honestly care what your role is or what your work is. It's important. And in saying that it's important, that means you have an obligation to lead yourself to do it well. And I worked in physician practices for a very long time. And one of the things the physicians I worked with, yes, rank has its privileges, but with privilege comes responsibility and authority. None of that really matters at the end of the day if everybody isn't there doing their job. So no one in any physician practice, from my perspective, is more or less important than someone else. We just have those different levels of responsibility and authority with privilege. And so it is that mindset that I think we all need to have, is that recognizing that every job exists for a reason. And if you've been given the privilege of that job, then own it. Is my way of looking at it. I can go off on a whole nother conversation about, what you own and don't own as far as your jobs are concerned. But at the end of the day, for those of you, I'm assuming most of this audience, your folks are responsible for getting us all the things we need to do our jobs, whether we're in a medical setting or any other industrial setting. Folks in supply chain are responsible for the parts and pieces that make us all able to do our work. That's a really big deal, okay? So it's just keeping perspective on all of that is, I think, what's really important.
And Deb, I'll say, just back to that leadership piece, you're helping us lead this podcast right off.
Yes.
As you're our first guest. And I think you've done just a phenomenal job today. And I heard you also throw out some potential topics for the future, maybe for a return visit. This will happen a lot with our guests as we continue to record. We'll be like, well, I think we're going to have you back on a future episode. And that'll happen a lot. But I never thought it would happen on our very first interview. Fantastic job today. Thank you for joining us.
Well, so no pressure. I didn't know I was the first one. So it's been fun talking with you guys. And I certainly have had a great time doing it. But I think it's really important for folks to know that working from home is here to stay. So figure it out.
That was Deborah Wiggs, founder at V2V Management Solutions, and talking about something that I think everybody on this call, at least, and many people who are listening, most of you most likely, adjusting to working from home. And I can remember when I left my job as a provider, working as a nurse and doing shift work, it was a very difficult transition for me, harder than I thought it would be. Everybody always thinks, working from home, wouldn't that be a dream? But it really did turn my schedule upside down. A lot of the things that Deb talked about in the interview today, I did not do. I didn't have a schedule. I didn't schedule time for myself or away from work. I definitely did not frame my environment. I was often working on the couch because nobody else was home and they were all off to work. And all of those really did have consequences. It took me a long time to figure out a strategy, including when to go to the gym, so that I had some structure in my day-to-day, Hayes. And I know you do a lot of webinars. You probably faced a pretty similar challenge initially, or even as you were getting ready to do webinars. How did you frame your space, as Deb puts it?
That's a really good point, Justin. Obviously, I've been working from home for many, many years now, but 2020 created a lot more video work, correct? To your point, a lot of webinars, a lot of Zoom calls. So yes, what she talked about was really, really relevant to me. And I'm sure everybody else out there trying to get a proper space that with your background looks decent. The lighting was good. All those things that she talked about that are important. Yes, I had to do that. So absolutely. And it was, to me, I learned a lot from her. So that was great. She did a good job.
Yeah. First impressions are still a thing, even on Skype, Zoom, Teams, etc. But that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support Power Supply by subscribing on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And on behalf of Gary Hayes and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply.